There is a remarkable contradiction sitting inside Donald Trump's latest attempt to rewrite the history of the Russia investigation. His own White House released previously classified FBI material, apparently hoping it would strengthen the argument that investigators had manufactured a case against him. Instead, according to reporting on those documents, the material appears to illuminate something Trump has spent years insisting should never have existed in the first place. Investigators had serious counterintelligence concerns about his relationship with Russia, and one potentially important part of that inquiry was never pursued as broadly as the FBI originally contemplated. That matters because this is no longer simply an argument about what happened in 2016. It is an argument about whether a government can release authentic documents, attach a political narrative to them, and count on the public never examining whether the documents actually support the conclusion. Start with the basic distinction because almost everything else depends on it. There were different questions surrounding Trump and Russia. One was criminal. Did particular people commit crimes that prosecutors could prove? Another was counterintelligence. Did relationships, financial dependencies, contacts, vulnerabilities, or foreign influence create a national security concern even if they did not amount to a prosecutable crime? Those are not interchangeable questions. And according to the account described in this material, that distinction may explain one of the most misunderstood parts of the entire Mueller era. After FBI Director James Comey was fired in May of 2017, the FBI opened an extraordinary counterintelligence inquiry examining whether Trump himself could represent a counterintelligence concern involving Russia. Merely opening such an investigation did not establish that Trump was controlled by Russia, compromised by Russia, or guilty of anything. An investigation is not a verdict. That distinction is essential, but the existence of the concern is still historically significant. The FBI apparently believed the circumstances were serious enough to ask a question that would be extraordinary under any president. Could the President of the United States knowingly or unknowingly be vulnerable to a foreign intelligence service? Then Robert Mueller was appointed special counsel. And this is where the story becomes much more complicated than the familiar political version. According to New York Times reporting described in the source material, then Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein did not instruct Mueller to conduct an unrestricted counterintelligence investigation into Trump. Mueller's mandate centered on criminal matters. Responsibility for counterintelligence issues was reportedly transferred to FBI personnel working alongside Mueller, but the counterintelligence work was limited by the scope of the special counsel's jurisdiction. That distinction has enormous consequences. For years, Americans were told competing versions of what Mueller had investigated. Trump and his allies described the entire enterprise as an obsessive attempt to investigate him and his relationship with Russia. Many Trump critics, meanwhile, assumed Mueller was examining virtually every relevant dimension of that relationship. But if this newly highlighted record is accurately understood, neither description captures the whole picture. Mueller investigated Russian interference, contacts involving people associated with the campaign, possible criminal conduct, and obstruction-related issues. But the much broader counterintelligence examination that some FBI officials apparently envisioned, including a potentially deeper investigation of Trump's personal and financial history involving Russia, was not conducted in the sweeping form people might have assumed. Think about the standard that should apply here. If investigators believed any president, Republican or Democrat, might possess financial or personal vulnerabilities relevant to a sophisticated foreign intelligence service, would you want that question quietly narrowed because investigating a sitting president was politically explosive? That does not mean investigators should receive unlimited authority. It means the public deserves clarity about which questions were actually investigated before politicians claim those questions were definitively answered. And that brings us to Trump's finances. According to the account presented here, during an Oval Office interview in 2017, Trump was asked whether Mueller would cross a red line by investigating his finances. Trump indicated that he would. Again, that statement does not prove there was something incriminating in his financial history. People can oppose an investigation for many reasons. A president may consider an inquiry illegitimate, excessively broad, politically motivated, or constitutionally dangerous. But investigators were apparently considering precisely the kind of financial examination Trump publicly warned against. One person familiar with the matter reportedly characterized what the FBI had contemplated as something resembling a Manhattan Project examination of Trump's finances, designed to understand where his money had come from and whether those relationships created counterintelligence vulnerabilities. And according to the material we have, that sweeping financial counterintelligence investigation never happened. That is a much narrower conclusion than saying investigators would have discovered wrongdoing. We do not know that. You cannot treat an investigation that never occurred as evidence of what it would have found. But you also cannot honestly describe an unexamined question as a question that was investigated and resolved. That is the first major contradiction. The political narrative says Trump was investigated endlessly over Russia. The newly emphasized record suggests one of the broadest and potentially most consequential counterintelligence questions about Trump himself was constrained before investigators could pursue it in the manner originally contemplated. Now ask yourself something more difficult. Which is the greater institutional danger? Allowing investigators too much freedom to examine a president, or allowing the political sensitivity of investigating a president to prevent legitimate national security questions from being fully examined? There is no comfortable answer. A constitutional system has to guard against both abuses at the same time. And this is where the White House document release becomes so interesting. According to the source material, the administration presented a collection of previously classified FBI memoranda as evidence supporting Trump's long-running argument that a hostile deep state targeted him and that the Russia investigation was essentially a political operation. But the New York Times reportedly found little new material fundamentally undermining the FBI's original rationale for opening the Russia investigation. Instead, those documents helped expose the internal limitations placed on the investigation. That is almost the inverse of the political message attached to their release. The documents can be genuine, while the interpretation promoted around them remains questionable. This is one of the most important habits to develop when consuming political information. The document is real, and the politician's description of what the document proves is accurate are two completely different claims. A declassified memo can be authentic and still be selectively framed. A quotation can be accurate and still be stripped of the context that changes its meaning. An investigation can fail to establish an allegation without proving the opposite proposition. And an official release can reveal information embarrassing to the very people who released it. That appears to be the tension here. There is another example inside the same broader pattern. John Solomon, a Trump-aligned journalist who has been involved in efforts examining election-related allegations, is heard in the supplied material acknowledging something important about the intelligence evidence. He says the intelligence community has no evidence that a foreign power flipped votes in the 2020, 2022, or 2024 elections. That does not resolve every argument anyone has ever raised about election administration. It does not mean every election system is perfect. It does not eliminate legitimate questions about security procedures, rules, or administration. But it matters because claims of foreign powers literally changing votes are extremely serious claims, and serious claims require evidence proportionate to their seriousness. If the available intelligence does not establish that foreign actors flipped votes, then the responsible conclusion is not to invent evidence that would make the desired narrative work. The responsible conclusion is to say what the evidence establishes and stop there. And this is exactly where people get played. A real document, a real investigation, or a real intelligence finding can be presented beside a conclusion that goes several steps beyond what the underlying evidence actually proves. That gap is why I created Don't Get Played, the evidence discipline for American politics. It is a practical field manual for separating the claim from the evidence behind it, using tools like the 10-minute verification protocol, the evidence ladder, and a claim ledger that forces you to distinguish what is established from what is merely asserted. If you want the complete system, the link is in the video description and the first pinned comment. Keep that method in mind here, because the next distinction is where this story becomes even more consequential. The absence of evidence that votes were flipped cannot simply be transformed into evidence for a different election conspiracy. In exactly the same way, the absence of a criminal charge against Trump arising from a broad financial counterintelligence investigation cannot prove that investigators examined every relevant financial relationship and found nothing, particularly if that broad investigation never occurred. These are basic evidentiary distinctions, yet political messaging constantly collapses them. No prosecution becomes total exoneration. An investigation becomes proof of guilt. A declassified document becomes a bombshell before anyone asks what the document actually says. A suspicion becomes a conclusion. And then everyone argues about the conclusion, while almost nobody goes back to the underlying record. That is why Rosenstein's role matters. According to the reporting described in the source material, Rosenstein did not authorize Mueller to conduct an open ended counterintelligence investigation into Trump. There were understandable institutional reasons to be cautious. Investigating a sitting president as a potential counterintelligence threat raises profound constitutional and democratic questions. The executive branch possesses enormous investigative powers. Allowing those powers to be used without meaningful boundaries against an elected president could itself create an extraordinary abuse. That is the strongest reasonable defense of narrowing the inquiry. Maybe Rosenstein believed Mueller needed a defined criminal mandate rather than permission to explore every aspect of Trump's life. Maybe limiting the investigation was necessary to prevent a legitimate inquiry from becoming an unlimited search for wrongdoing. That argument deserves to be taken seriously, but taking it seriously creates another obligation. If the investigation was deliberately narrow, politicians cannot later point to the investigation as though it conclusively resolved questions that were outside that narrow mandate. You cannot defend the limitations when those limitations protect presidential power, and then erase those same limitations when claiming the president was comprehensively cleared. That is not a partisan standard, it is a logical one. Reverse the political identities. Imagine a Democratic president had long-standing business relationships that generated counterintelligence concerns involving a foreign adversary. Imagine investigators considered a deep examination of those relationships, senior Justice Department officials restricted that examination, and years later the president's allies claimed the investigation proved there was nothing worth investigating. Would the limitations suddenly seem irrelevant, or would people correctly ask what was actually examined? The same evidentiary standard should survive a change in party. Former CIA Director John Brennan, speaking in the material provided, argues that questions remained about contacts involving Russians and people around Trump and about whether individuals could have been targeted knowingly or unknowingly by Russian intelligence. That is Brennan's assessment. It should be identified as such. It is not proof that Trump was recruited by Russia. It is not proof that Trump knowingly acted for Russia. And it certainly does not justify declaring someone an agent merely because counterintelligence officials had concerns. Foreign intelligence operations are often more complicated than that. Intelligence services can cultivate relationships, exploit incentives, manipulate information, or identify vulnerabilities without the target necessarily understanding the full purpose of the relationship. That is precisely why counterintelligence investigations do not operate under the same logic as ordinary criminal prosecutions. A criminal case asks whether prosecutors can establish specific offenses. Counterintelligence asks whether a foreign actor can exploit a relationship, vulnerability, dependency, access point, or pattern of behavior. Sometimes those two inquiries overlap, sometimes they do not. That difference is crucial because the public debate around Miller often treated the absence of a criminal conspiracy charge as though it answered every possible national security question surrounding Russia. It did not necessarily do that. At the same time, critics of Trump sometimes committed the opposite error, treating unusual contacts or unresolved questions as proof of a hidden relationship that had already been established. That goes beyond the evidence, too. The intellectually responsible position is more demanding because it denies both sides the certainty they may want. Russian interference in the 2016 election was a serious national security issue. Investigators examined contacts involving Trump campaign associates. Extraordinary counterintelligence concerns arose after Trump became president. But the broader examination of Trump's own financial and historical relationships with Russia described in this material was apparently not conducted in the comprehensive manner some FBI officials had envisioned. That means there are questions the historical record may not answer, and an unanswered question is exactly that, unanswered, not evidence of innocence, not evidence of guilt, an unresolved question. This distinction becomes even more important when political institutions control the release of classified information. Declassification can serve the public interest. Governments classify too much information, sometimes for legitimate security reasons, and sometimes because secrecy protects institutions from embarrassment. Releasing historical documents can improve democratic accountability, but selective declassification can also become a political instrument. An administration controls which documents appear, when they appear, what context accompanies them, and what narrative officials emphasize before journalists or citizens have had time to read the material. That creates an enormous information advantage. The government does not necessarily need to falsify anything. It can release something genuine and encourage a conclusion that the material only partially supports. Then the headline moves faster than the correction. The clip travels faster than the document, and the political interpretation becomes familiar before the underlying evidence becomes understood. That is why the question should never simply be, is this document authentic? Ask what proposition the document actually establishes. Ask what it does not establish. Ask whether relevant records are missing. Ask whether the conclusion depends on one source or multiple independent sources. Ask whether the person presenting the evidence has accurately described its limitations, and ask what evidence would change your own conclusion. That last question is uncomfortable, but essential. If no possible evidence could change your view of Trump, Mueller, the FBI, Brennan, Rosenstein, or the Russia investigation, then you are no longer evaluating evidence. You are protecting an identity. The standard has to work even when the result is politically inconvenient. The strongest finding here is therefore not a new proof that Trump secretly worked for Russia. The supplied material does not establish that. It is something more precise. The record described here indicates that investigators considered a much broader counterintelligence examination of Trump than the investigation that ultimately occurred. Rosenstein reportedly limited Mueller's mandate. A potentially expansive financial inquiry was not carried out as originally contemplated, and documents released by Trump's own White House, apparently intended to reinforce his preferred account of the Russia investigation, have instead helped bring those limitations back into public view. That creates a credibility problem for anyone presenting the new material as a simple vindication. If the documents reveal that important investigative avenues were constrained, then they cannot simultaneously be treated as evidence that those avenues were exhaustively investigated and produced nothing. The administration can argue that the restrictions were appropriate. Trump can argue that the entire inquiry should never have begun. Critics can argue that investigators should have gone further. Those are competing interpretations. But the scope of the investigation is a factual question, not an ideological one. And scope matters because conclusions are only as broad as the questions actually tested. This principle reaches far beyond Donald Trump. Every administration has incentives to package information favorably. Every political movement has supporters willing to interpret ambiguous evidence in the direction they already prefer. Every newsroom can make framing choices. Every investigator can make mistakes. Every intelligence agency operates with uncertainty. And every citizen is vulnerable to believing a claim faster when it confirms something already believed. The democratic safeguard is not finding one institution or personality that can never be wrong. It is insisting on standards that make error and manipulation easier to detect. Show the document, identify the claim, separate what is known from what is inferred, explain the scope, acknowledge the missing evidence, present the strongest competing interpretation, and do not allow the certainty of the language to exceed the certainty of the record. By that standard, the latest release does not settle the Russia debate in the sweeping way Trump's political narrative would require. It does not establish that Trump was controlled by Russia. It does not establish that a broader financial investigation would have uncovered wrongdoing. It does not establish that every FBI decision was justified. But neither does it support pretending that every significant counterintelligence question surrounding Trump was comprehensively investigated and disproven. The available account points instead to an investigation with boundaries. Boundaries that mattered then and still matter when people describe what Mueller supposedly proved. That is the central contradiction we started with. Documents released to reinforce the argument that Trump was unfairly targeted appear to provide additional insight into how a potentially broader examination of Trump was actually restricted. The political argument can continue. The evidentiary question is narrower. What did investigators examine? What were they prevented or discouraged from examining? And what conclusions can responsibly be drawn from the work they actually completed? On the material available here, the answer is not that every suspicion was validated. It is not that every suspicion was debunked. It is that the historical investigation was narrower in an important respect than much of the public debate has assumed. And if democratic accountability means anything, politicians should not be allowed to convert that limitation into certainty. The broader lesson is simple but demanding. The next political bombshell will arrive long before this argument disappears, and it will probably come packaged with a clip, memo, poll, court filing, intelligence claim, or statistic that seems to prove something instantly. Don't Get Played was built for exactly that moment, to help you move from reacting to testing and from borrowing someone else's certainty to examining the evidence yourself. The system covers political claims, records, media, statistics, and even synthetic content. The link to get the ebook is in the description and the first pinned comment. Because accountability starts with one discipline that should never depend on which side benefits. Make the claim, earn the conclusion.